Okay, there's so many things happening. So just last night, I heard Tara Reade is staying in Russia. And so what Guardian the report using the word, they're saying Biden accused Tara Reade defects to Russia. So they use the word defects, but I did saw her announcement. She actually said she would prefer to keep her U.S. citizen, which doesn't sound to me like a defects. But what's your view on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, defection is a language that was used about people who came from the Soviet Union and came to the West during the Cold War, and people who were generally spies working for the Soviet Union in the West would sometimes go to the Soviet Union. I mean, this is a completely inappropriate use of language today. I mean, Tara Reade, for whatever reason, you can think of all sorts of very good reasons, has decided that she finds it easier at the moment to live in Russia, and she's chosen to stay there. But she has not cut the links to her home country. That's what defectors do, or used to do. I mean, the point was, if you defected from the Soviet Union and went to live in the West, you were basically severing your connection with the Soviet Union, and the same the other way around. You couldn't just go back. So this is completely inappropriate language, but it is very, very characteristic of the way the media operates today. And the reason they're doing that, by the way, the reason the Guardian is using that language about Tara Reade is, of course, because they want to undermine her credibility, say that these allegations she's made about Biden, which, by the way, are allegations which other people have also made. I'm not saying that they're true, but there has been a pattern of these allegations, that this allegation that she has made shouldn't be taken seriously because, of course, she's a defector. And as a defector, we mustn't pay any attention to her. She's gone and is working for the other side, which is ridiculous.
Well, what I heard was it's Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, who told her that it might not be safe for her to return. That's what I heard. Pretty reliable source, but I can see, in particular, we just talk about the election, and I mean, who knows what they're capable of doing, right? If she becomes too much of it, because during the election, the last time, there was some focus on her, but then they kind of like killed her story. I mean, they just ignored her. But now, the election coming again, they are suspicious that she might become the focus again or something. It's quite possible that the Biden administration is not comfortable with her. It could be Biden's situation.
Absolutely. I mean, at the very least, they might be considering bringing legal action against her. And and I'm not going to explore the law here because I'm not familiar with the laws in the United States. But the one thing that might do is wipe her out financially, even if it doesn't result in any actual decision. I mean, I don't get the impression that she's a wealthy person.
No.
So, she might decide that it's not a good idea to risk returning to the United States. I can understand that. I don't have any reason to think that that's wrong. And she might also feel, she might be right in this, or she might be wrong, that the reach of the United States is very long, and staying in another European country might not be advisable. We have a prisoner here in London, in Belmarsh Prison, who's been there for any length of time. He's not been tried for any crime in Britain. He's not been prosecuted for any crime in Britain. He's not committed any crime in Britain, but he's in Belmarsh because the United States basically wants him there. So there you go.
I definitely. The reason Tara Reade, I think a lot of people paid attention is, I would say, her experience, the fact that the media pretty much ignored her story about her experience with Joe Biden, pretty much, I would say, ended the Me Too movement, right? The Me Too pretty much lost all its credibility with her story, the way she was treated versus all the other so-called victims. I mean, they might or may not be victims, but everybody take everyone's accusation very seriously except hers when it's about Biden. And so that was the end. I think that's the end of the Me Too movement.
Well, indeed it was. And in fact, I mean, you hear and see so much less about it now, and I would agree with that completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it quickly became clear that Me Too, whatever it was originally, and I think originally there were real grievances by women who had been terribly abused. There was real anger, but that the people who eventually gained control of it had a partisan political agenda, which ultimately was more important for them than any real abuse towards women. Because as far as I can see, not only was she not listened to, but she was absolutely sidelined, as you correctly say. Nobody seems to have explored her allegations in any to any extent at all. And I just want to repeat again, I'm not talking about the truth of these allegations, but she's not the only person who's made allegations of this kind about Biden.
Yeah. Just so you know that the Me Too in China, even people, quite a few Chinese believe that the Me Too is simply exported to China, or China can say imported to China, to try to divide China and try to stir problems in China. There is also that thinking that the Chinese people are more suspicious about the Western movement now coming to China.
With excellent cause, can I say? And I mean, this immediately brings to mind for me a particularly outrageous business, which I, by the way, commented about on my channel at the time, which is about that Chinese tennis player for a short while ago. And I mean, the way it was represented in the West, which is very much, taking all the tropes that we associate with Me Too, was that this person had been abused by a senior person in China, and that this was a non-consensual relationship. And then I finally, with some difficulty, by the way, got actual proper Chinese translations of what this person had actually said. And it turned out that the story bore no relation to the way it was being presented in the West. And then, of course, it was alleged also that she'd been disappeared in some fashion, and it was completely not the case. And again, it was obvious to me that this unfortunate person who had gone through a troubled time had been used by the media in the West, not just the media in the West, by some political forces in the West as part of an anti-China campaign. And they were plugging the story continuously. I mean, even after she came out, she said, you've got it all wrong, but still they persisted with it. They were still saying, they were still running with things that she was alleged to have said, but never did in fact say. And despite the fact that she was pointing that fact out. So I think that I can completely understand why Chinese people are particularly suspicious of this. By the way, can I just say again, my own experience in China, and I just say this, is that when I went to Shanghai, I was traveling in Shanghai and other places, public decorum between men and women is taken extremely seriously there, much more so than in the West. And I did see some really unattractive incidents of male on female behavior in Shanghai, and they were all done by Western expats. In Shanghai, I was rather astonished to see the behavior of some of the young Western expats there. But anyway, that's what I'm going to say. So on this topic.
A lot of the Western things coming in actually. China probably didn't even have that problem, but then somehow the West make it a problem in a way. Now, I want to say sexual harassment in the working place, it exists. It exists everywhere. Of
course it does.
Absolutely, yes. But Me Too is nowhere near to address that. It's very much, in the end, becomes some kind of propaganda, kind of a divide men and women kind of a thing. And even to the degree in China, maybe kind of like a regime change too or something. But also, I think there is a transgender woman, Jin Xing, in China. One time she said something. She said that before the Western came in, we have gay, we have lesbian, we have, whatever. And people don't label them. Okay, if you're gay, you're gay. Okay, you live your life and I live mine. I'm not gay, but I have nothing against you. But it is the Western coming in and they label everything. You're gay, you're lesbian, you're transgender. And immediately everybody look like different. Because you have different names, then you become a different group of people. So that's actually from a transgender woman herself. She said that. She said, we didn't have all this and everybody's fine, so.
I remember the leading advocate of gay rights in Russia making exactly the same point. This is at the time of the Sochi Olympics, and he became extremely upset at the way in which the West was using the issue of gay rights in Russia. He said, look, we've not got any issues like this, the kind you're saying. Obviously, there's things we'd like to change within our society, but this is our society. We don't want you coming in and recruiting us unwillingly as soldiers in your struggle. And the effect, by the way, was that this particular individual, I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, suddenly became himself the target of virulent abuse by some people in the West. So, but you're absolutely right. The United States has this culture war, as it's called. I'm not sure what the culture is, but anyway, it's called a culture war. It exports it around the world, and at the same time, it uses it as a mechanism to interfere in other countries. And again, the great exponent of this is Tony Blinken, as the Secretary of State. He's actually made it was actually in a discussion he had with Chinese officials, not, I think, the famous one in Anchorage, but in another one that happened later. He said, yes, we accept that there is a thing called international law, but international law is trumped by human rights law. Human rights law is superior to international law, and human rights law is interpreted according to our values. So you could see the whole line that is taking. So international law says you can't interfere in the internal affairs of another country, but you can interfere if it's a violation of human rights, and it's the United States which has the values which enables it to decide when human rights are violated. So it opens the way for the United States to interfere directly in other countries. It was an extraordinary statement, and I think it was Wang Yi who was there, and and it was. I can remember there was a very tense exchange between the two men over this topic.
Yeah, and in the meantime, they're complaining that China is not responsive to lots of their requests for meetings, right? I mean, how can they constantly lecturing all the Chinese officials, and then when China says enough, we don't want to meet you, then they're complaining, why are you not meeting us? So.
Yeah. Well, the United States, when it talks about meetings, it's important always to understand, and this is invariably true, the United States doesn't want a meeting which is conducted as a dialogue. It wants a meeting which is conducted as a lecture. So it lectures. The other side's job is to sit there quietly and listen to the lecture. And China, which is a powerful country with a long history, has said, well, we're not interested in that. And the Americans find that very, very astonishing, because everybody listens to the United States, and they're becoming very aggrieved about it. I can understand the Chinese. I tell you something else. I'll let you into a secret. 99% of the world is delighted China is taking this stance. They all wish they could do the same.
Yeah. Okay. About Ukraine, there's a lot of things happening there. Okay. It seems like there's a never-ending escalation. Okay. Whenever I thought, okay, it calms down, it seems winding up, winding down, and well, something happens, right? So they started with a javelin. They said they're not going to give the javelin, and then it's a howitzer, and then the Leopard tank, right? And the HIMARS and Patriot batteries, the Challenger tanks. And then not so long ago was depleted uranium. Okay, now it's the F-16, right? Every time they were saying, okay, we're not giving, and then in the end they give to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to ask you, now when this is Sunak, I guess, decided to give depleted uranium to Ukraine, is there any reaction in the UK, in the people saying this is not a good idea, or everybody just let him do it?
This is one of the most upsetting things personally for me, because when depleting uranium shells we first became aware of them at the time of the first Iraq war in 1991. I mean, there was a lot of concern in Britain, especially, about the effect of these things and the fact that they produce toxic materials, that if you ingest the dust that these depleted uranium shells produce, it can I mean, it can have enormously terrible consequences for people, shorten lives, cause those lives to end in really unpleasant, horrible ways. And also the ability of this dust to contaminate the landscape, the soil, the food that's produced. So there was a lot of discussion about this in Britain, and you had a kind of campaign basically seeking to outlaw depleted uranium shells. And Ukraine comes along and Britain says we're going to supply depleted uranium shells to Ukraine. And there is no debate in Britain about this at all. I've seen no one, I've seen none of the mainstream media discuss it, even the very minor alternative media that we have in Britain, which is on a very small scale. They haven't really addressed this issue. It's not been discussed in the House of Commons. It's not been discussed in the public space at all. We've gone from a situation where just a few years ago we were condemning these weapons to a situation where we are supplying these weapons to a war zone and nobody seems to care. And it's one of these things, just another one of these things, which shocks me and has really, really depressed me about the state of my own country.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear any report about anybody like in a prominent position saying this is really something we need to take very seriously, right? This is not something.
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, indeed. Well, indeed. And of course, it might at some point invite retaliation. I went on Russian television briefly, and there was a Russian journalist who said to me, do people in Britain understand that sooner or later that the day may come when we might feel obliged to retaliate?
Yeah.
The answer is, I don't think they do believe. I don't think they understand that. I don't think they believe it will ever happen. I think they have an attitude of utter impunity. They think they can go on supplying these things and treating this war as a thing that goes on far away and that they can sort of cheer on from the sidelines. An unattractive aspect of British life, by the way, that has been true throughout British history. Adam Smith in the 18th century was already complaining about it. And without risking any possible backlash upon themselves. And I think that is a completely irresponsible and reckless idea. I mean, the fact that the Russians up to now have shown extreme restraint in the face of these unceasing provocations doesn't mean that they will always do so. But nobody in Britain seems to think like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing about the Western countries in the current state, right? When Meng Wanzhou was kidnapped in Canada, before US asked Canada, US actually asked 23 countries to do that. And 23 countries said no to US. They just didn't think this is a good idea. This is something between China and US. Why would you want to be in the middle of this? Well, of all countries, Canada did. And then Canada was so surprised that China arrested 2 Canadian citizens. They would seem like a surprise that China would do it. What do you expect? Right? Why do you bring this to yourself? You're just thinking China would just take it and not doing anything, right? That's just something, it seems like, okay. I mean, Justin Trudeau, don't get me even started. The guy was, I don't know, just like a schoolboy. I don't know. He doesn't seem knowing what he's doing at all. And he's constantly shocked, it seems like.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I have to say, I mean, again, I have difficulty speaking about Justin Trudeau for the same reasons. I mean, he's a particular leader that for some reason gets me very angry. But anyway, but you're absolutely correct. But the British do act like this. Not just the British, the Western powers do act like this. I can remember, and I'm talking now about Britain. that there was again some big issue in Britain. I think it was about the Uyghurs. I can't remember. I mean, they come up with so many different things.
Yeah.
A whole lot of people were talking about the Uyghurs, and then China basically issued a list saying these people aren't welcome in China anymore, which is China's right to do.
Yeah.
And these people were collectively shocked. I mean, how dare China do that? And how outrageous! And it was something that Westerners are not used to. I mean, they have been dominating the world for a very long time now, and it is somehow contrary to nature, or so they think, for other countries to do to them that which they do unto others.
Yeah, and they don't seem learning. I mean, people have been reacting, again and again, but they don't seem. And the other country is Norway. I just believe one day Russia, maybe even possible Germany, will revenge because of Nord Stream. Why would Norway do something like that? Again, this is something US wanted to do. Why does Norway, a small country so close to Russia, why would it do something like that?
Well, I think you've touched on a very important point there, because of course Norway is a small country and it is very close to Russia, and it has had all kinds of prickly relations with Russia. Not that the Russians have ever done anything aggressive to Norway. On the contrary, as various Russians point out, Russia actually liberated the north of Norway from the Nazis during the Second World War. It's a fact which many people don't know. There was a war and the Red Army advanced across northern Scandinavia, and they moved into northern Norway, which was at that time occupied by the Nazis. And it was the only Allied force, by the way, that actually entered Norway during the Second World War. And the Nazis were pushed back, the Germans were pushed back. And after the war, the Soviet Union pulled its troops out. So they didn't try and stay there and occupy the place. So they never had any quarrels with Norway on their side. But the Norwegians, at least there is a current of Norwegian opinion which is very hostile to Russia. And I've never quite understood it, but you can see it. And because they're a small country, they know that by themselves they can't do that. So they want to do something bad to Russia. So they think that they can piggyback off the United States, because the United States is going to be there to protect them if they get into trouble. So it's their way, if you like, of poking the bear. They feel that they don't really have to fit. They can poke the bear as much as they like, because if the bear turns on them, the United States is there to protect them. Now, that is a very, very reckless and irresponsible way of thinking, because of course the United States is far away. It has its own problems. It's got its own concerns. One day it might decide that its interests lie elsewhere, at which point, of course, a country like Norway might find that it's wrecked its relations with Russia, but the Russians are still there next door.
And one day US might find it to have a good relationship with Russia is important. Who knows, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the US could just blame everything on Norway, throw Norway under the bus. You never know.
That is a very good point. And perhaps it's more true of Britain than it is of Norway, because at least Norway, I mean, nobody, I think, takes Norway as an international actor particularly seriously. But Britain is taken seriously as an international actor. It's a bigger country. And of course, it's had its long history. So the British taking this role of constantly being the most aggressive party in relations towards Russia exposes Britain to an extreme degree if US policy suddenly shifts and seeks a rapprochement with Russia. And that is a very real possibility. I mean, it's happened before. It could happen again. The British are misguided if they think that American policy on this is necessarily going to be constant.
They don't think very far. I think that's the problem. They're just thinking now, okay, it's a good idea to do everything you can to please United States, I guess. They don't think very far.
Yes,
But
well, there is another thing, you see, which is, I think, some of them, and this is, I think, again, extremely unwise, think that if they can keep relations between Russia and the US as bad as making them as bad as possible, and Britain can
yeah,
contribute to that, then that will keep the Americans permanently on side. I mean, bear in mind that it was a British diplomat who, way back in 1950, said that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down.
yeah,
So, the British want to keep the Americans involved in Europe. But of
yeah.
course, what they are risking is that
Hmm.
one day the Americans and the Russians will get together, they'll compare
Hmm.
notes with each other, they'll
Hmm.
realize that it's the British playing this game, and that will turn them both against Britain. And that is by no means impossible. And as you live in the United States, I mean, I'm sure you will agree with me, there is in the United States always a subcurrent of anti-British feeling,
Yeah,
which
yes.
could rise to the surface very easily if the right conditions arose for it to do so.
Yes, I mean, just recently there are some economists who was talking about how much the British bankers are behind the scene. There's some families still controlling the Federal Reserve to the degree he even said something like, do you think we win the independence war? My answer is it remains to be seen. He even said something like that.
Yes,
I
yes,
mean, but Federal Reserve does have a lot of problems. The Federal Reserve banks, the families behind them, they are all over the world. They are
yes,
many are living in UK and
yes,
in Europe. So that's the truth.
yes,
Yeah. So there
absolutely,
are people who simply not happy about that.
absolutely,
They
completely,
want more US centric, in the financial market. Yeah.
yes.
So um Russia for its part moving nuclear warheads to Belarus. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Well, first of all, I say that I should say I find that a very concerning and very, very worrying development indeed. It's not something I'm pleased about or welcome
No.
at all. I very much wish it didn't happen. But the reason I think that they've moved nuclear weapons into Belarus is actually very straightforward, which is that we are now in a period of extreme international tension. Belarus has become part of Russia's western flank. So the Russians moving nuclear weapons into Belarus is intended to deter a possible Western attack on Belarus. I mean, it is as simple as that. Now, there have been, I should say, lots of stories, some of them amplified by President Lukashenko of Belarus, perhaps for his own reasons, but some of them may be plausible that, the Baltic states, Poland, some of the Western powers have been thinking of some kind of military move against Belarus. And of course, the former Polish defense minister very recklessly said that there could be a coup or an uprising in Belarus soon, at which point the Polish army might need to intervene. Now, I don't think there's any chance of either of those things happening, but he is talking about the Polish army entering Belarus. So by moving nuclear weapons into Belarus, the Russians say, you stay out. This is our ally. Don't interfere, and don't even think about attacking it, because if you do, you will be taking incredible risks upon yourself.
Poland is everywhere. Just recently, also circulating in Chinese media. I don't see much reporting in the West. Lithuania is on the brink of bankruptcy. The whole country is having
Yes.
some serious problem. So apparently in China, they're saying that at least someone from Poland are suggesting, well, you have financial trouble, let us help you. You can just come back, become part of Poland. So someone apparently, that's what the Chinese media has been reporting. I don't know how serious that is, but apparently somebody from Poland suggested that. They even said,
absolutely.
They even said that they actually quoted the Chinese ambassador Lu saying, okay, according to Chinese ambassador Lu, you don't have the international agreement, which is totally misquoting him. Okay, let's just say that. That's not what he meant at all. But anyway, they even quoted him to saying you don't have any, laws or agreement to prove that you have independent away from the Soviet, something like that. So Poland just seems like everywhere.
Well, indeed. I mean, can I just? There's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. Firstly, can I just talk about Lithuania? Because of course, one of the reasons Lithuania is in economic problems is twofold. Firstly, I mean, you only have to look at the map, geographically.
Mhm.
In order to prosper, it needs good relations with Russia. I mean,
Yeah.
Russia is the main hub through which goods pass. Lithuania, for its own reasons, has gone against the Russians in that way. But as I'm sure you recall, just a few years ago, I think it was just about a year, 2 years ago, Lithuania also got itself into an entirely pointless argument with China, pointless for Lithuania, over Taiwan. They were edging towards opening offices, from Taiwan, coming very close to recognizing Taiwan, knowing perfectly well that that was going to antagonize the Chinese government, antagonize China. And of course it did. And of course it affected trade between Lithuania and China. And the word that I got at the time was that, why are we doing this? We are doing this in order, in Lithuania, we're doing this in order to show to the Americans how loyal we are to you. So
Again.
you're sacrificing your fundamental economic interests in order to prove a point to the Americans. It doesn't seem at all wise to me. Now, this Lithuanian-Polish Union. Now, there is a history behind this because up to the 17th century, Poland was this enormous country. It included Lithuania, or at least it was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It included Poland, Lithuania, most of what is today Belarus, most of what is today Ukraine, including Kiev, by the way. And there is shall we say, a sentiment within the Polish political elite, which is to try to recreate this.
Yeah.
Now, I want to make it absolutely clear, because I've got lots of contacts in Poland. The vast majority of people in Poland are not interested in this idea at all. They don't want it. They see it as, in fact, ending Poland as it is today, submerging it in something completely different. And they're not happy with that. And of course, they're fully aware of the enormous geopolitical risks in trying to pursue this kind of venture. But unfortunately, these people who seem to be obsessed with this idea are very well represented in the current Polish government, and also in the part of the Polish electorate which this government relies upon in order to get re-elected. Now, Poland is also going through economic problems at the moment, not as severe as Lithuania's, but it's also got elections coming fairly soon. So the government is amplifying this rhetoric about recreating the Commonwealth, gaining back our lost territories in Ukraine, reuniting with Lithuania, absorbing Belarus. They're talking in this grandiose way, as much, I suspect, for domestic electoral reasons as for any others. I think it's going to turn out badly for them. I think that for every person they win over by doing that, they will lose many more. But there we go.
Yeah, So, but of course, in China, they see this as, okay, does it mean that Poland is going to open some kind of front, going
Yes.
somewhere? That's another escalation of the war. I mean, that's pretty serious. I hope they're only doing it for propaganda for their own election. There's nothing serious behind those thoughts, I hope. Okay.
Well, we don't fully know, because of course propaganda can of course achieve its own momentum, and they might find that events propelled them in that direction, even if that isn't quite what they'd intended. So I mean, I think it is a risk. I mean, I think it is a real risk. I would say that one particular element of Polish society that is said to be very hostile to all of these ideas is the Polish military. I mean, the Polish defense minister, who talked about, occupying Belarus is the ex-Polish defense minister. He's not the current one. The Polish military leadership are said to be very hostile to these ideas. And in fact, the Polish army, like most armies in the West, is seeing a big exit of people who were serving because they don't want to be in the Polish army if one day it's in order to advance into Belarus or Ukraine or any of these things. So without the army, how can these things be done?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, good. That's good. Okay. There's some rumor about the Lukashenko. He's got poisoned in Moscow. Is that true? What is your take on that?
Well, he has been ill. I don't think he's
Okay.
been poisoned. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I mean, he's made lots of comments about this himself. I mean, he seems all right at the moment.
Okay.
And I don't think he's been poisoned. I think one thing I ought to say is that he's not going to be president of Belarus for very much longer.
Mhm.
And I think that Russia and Belarus, or at least the Russians in Belarus, are already working on, you know, the way forward when he does eventually go. So, you know, I think that he's not going to be there for very much longer, but I don't think he was poisoned. Certainly the Russians
Oh,
wouldn't want to poison him. And
okay.
I think he was just ill, and I don't think it was a serious illness either.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. I think they tend to
Yeah.
exaggerate these kind of things. It could be just a regular health issue, and then they made it as something out of it. Yeah, that's my thinking too. But the drone attack, this morning, this is second round of drone attacks, right? So,
Yeah.
do you think it's just the Ukrainian doing this to escalate the war so that they force NATO to they want some strong reaction from Russia so that NATO will come in? Or is the US US somehow involved? So what's this latest drone attack?
Well, Putin has actually made a statement about this. He says that the purpose of these attacks is to provoke Russia into overreaction. And the reason that they want to provoke the Russians in that way into overreaction, I mean, he doesn't spell it out, but the only logical explanation is in order to persuade the West to take a more active role in the war. And I think that it's probably well understood in Ukraine that the only way Ukraine can survive or win this war is if it can get the West directly involved. So I think this is what this is about.
Been trying to get NATO in from the beginning, I think. I mean, they kept on provoking, escalating the war, trying to provoke Russia. But at some point, they have to get the message. NATO is not going to get in. They need to get that message.
They do need to get that message, but you come back to that comment that you made earlier in our program, which is unfortunately up to now, when they've asked for something, they've always got it. So they got the Javelins, they got the Stingers, they got the M777s, they got the HIMARS missiles, they got the Patriot system, they got the Storm Shadows from Britain, they're now going to get the F-16s, and they've already had the tanks. So it's easy to understand why, if you are Zelensky, you might think that if you don't take no for an answer, then at some point the Western cavalry will indeed ride to your rescue. And if you structure your entire war effort around achieving that objective, then if that is your belief, that starts to make a kind of sense.
Yeah. Okay, so Russia, I guess, is not going to immediately retaliate for all these drones, but they might continue. Who knows? There might be war, drone attacks. Yeah.
Well, the Russians, of course, are conducting much more powerful and severe attacks on Ukraine. I mean, and they're doing so pretty much every day. The point, however, that Putin made is that their attacks attack Ukrainian military installations and infrastructure. These Ukrainian attacks, by contrast, are indiscriminate. And he said very clearly, look, the thing that worries me is not these attacks. We can cope with these attacks. What worries me is that some people in our own country might want us to escalate in ways that would be extremely wrong and unwise. So Putin saying that, he's making it absolutely clear, it seems to me, that he at least is against escalation. He's not going to retaliate in kind to what the Ukrainians are doing.
Now, I do want to hear your reaction to the latest Lindsey Graham's video talking about the money well spent. Now, he did it later, I think on the Bloomberg or some articles, he's trying to walk it back, saying that's not exactly what he said. It's got kind of edited or something. But I have to say, Lindsey Graham, this coming from his mouth, I'm not surprised at all. This is not the first time he's talking like that. He talked about what, fighting until the last Ukrainian. He talked about fighting until the last Taiwanese. I mean, I have a video clip on them, so so I'm not surprised he talked that way.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. What's your reaction?
Absolutely. I mean, Lindsey Graham is, in my opinion, an extremely dangerous person in the United States because he's constantly pressing for these things. I mean, he also basically said that he'd like to see Vladimir Putin assassinated. I mean, he made comments like this. Now, the odd thing about these particular comments that he made, and everybody believes that he could, even if he didn't say this, he might have said it because he said, as you correctly said, essentially the same things in the past. But the point is, if anybody edited his words to make it look like he said the best money we've ever spent is that, on killing Russians, then it was the Ukrainians who edited his words because they published I think the video in which he appeared to be saying that. So I mean, but if he's upset that the Ukrainians did that or that the Russians are making hay of it, well, he's got no one to blame but himself.
Yeah. Why did he even go there?
Why did he even go there? And why does he talk in this way all the time? Lindsey Graham is, in my opinion, one of these incredibly dangerous people in the United States who always looks for military solutions to every problem, every international problem. And he sees his way to gain prominence in the United States by constantly plugging the most aggressive possible line. And that has a very, very negative effect on the formulation of policy in the United States. It means that people who perhaps want a more realistic foreign policy always have to contend with Lindsey Graham and people like him and the kind of sound atmosphere that they are creating.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and he's very influential. He's the ranking Republican, I think, in the Foreign Relations and or Intelligence Committee. Those powerful committees. He's in there. The other person is Mark Warner. Lindsey Graham is Republican. Mark Warner is Democrat. It's actually not that long ago. I actually saw Mark Warner was talking about not exactly what like Lindsey Graham saying the money is well spent, but he was saying that $100 billion or something. He said, if we're going to fight this war ourselves, it's going to be way more costly than this. So $100 billion is not much. See, that's how he sees this war going. Like, if you want to weaken Russia, $100 billion is nothing. Now, in his whole conversation, he never said anything about human lives. They are people dying there. There's not a single word about that. So in his term, it's like, okay, it's not that much. Now, that all of a sudden kind of explained to me, you're talking about a lot of times these people just don't have reverse gear. Now, that's the reason, I guess. Because in their view, it's worth the money. Other than this little money they spend, it's not their money anyway. It's a very good investment, seems like, in their view.
Yes.
Isn't that how? I mean, that's how they're thinking.
Well, that is indeed exactly how they're thinking, and you're absolutely correct. It is an absolutely psychopathic way of conducting foreign policy. First of all, you're absolutely right in saying that it shows no disregard it shows complete disregard for the humanitarian element. I mean, the fact that people are dying, that people are being killed, he sees it purely in cost-benefit terms for the United States. It's utterly cynical. It shows you that all the rhetoric about human rights, freedom, all of that. It really is. It's really only the mask behind the real thinking that's there. But the other thing, of course, he's doing is that he's straightforwardly admitting that the United States and Russia are in effect in a kind of state of undeclared war with each other. It's just that the United States doesn't want to fight Russia directly because that would be too dangerous. So it arms people in other people and arms other people to do it, to conduct these wars for itself. It shows a profoundly manipulative approach, a very manipulative approach on the part of American foreign policy. And I think people in Taiwan, by the way, should pay attention to what Mark Warner is saying, because it tells you, it should tell them that, you know, when the United States comes along and talks about Taiwan and its freedoms, its democracy, its rights, and all the rest, ultimately, it's just another pawn in the very complicated chess game that people like Mr. Mark Warner think they're playing.
Well, I think actually a lot of the Taiwan public probably is aware of that, and they are commentators. You know, they are people who are talking about this, but I don't think it's Tsai Ing-wen is, you know, the Taiwan government is. Whatever, I mean, they have been constantly talking about how to blow up the TSMC, and they don't seem to care that at all. They don't seem like taking that very seriously. They always find some excuses for those people. Oh, it got misquoted, it's edited from the mainland, you know, all that kind of thing. It's just mind-blowing to me. It's like, and by the way, you're talking about democracy in Taiwan. The current Taiwan government is very corrupt. They made some fake vaccine. I wouldn't say fake, but it's ineffective vaccine. But they injected to people anyway and make money because they want to make money on the stock market. So they made that. For a while, there are more people die of their vaccine than there are people died of COVID. Just so everybody should know that, you know, it's just extremely corrupt government. But then again, US seems like to support government that are corrupted, like the Ukrainian government, right?
Well, unsurprisingly so, because governments made up by honest people might be more concerned about the societies that they lead. So, I mean, you know, in effect, the United States is always drawn towards supporting corrupt governments. It's doing that in Ukraine, it's doing that in Taiwan, it did that in Afghanistan, it did that in Vietnam, South Vietnam, as I well remember. And, you know, if you go back to the early 1950s, it was doing the same in South Korea. The people don't want to talk about that anymore.
They're easy to control, to manipulate with these people.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Serbia. You understand the people in China pay a lot of attention to Serbia, and Vučić is very popular in the people in China, and Serbia and China has very good relationship. And of course, Kosovo is almost like the Taiwan issue, right? They do not want Kosovo to be independent, but then the West somehow decided to do that. So my question is this: I never quite figure out why the West want to give Serbia so much hard time. They almost like hate Serbia, right? In 1993, they bombed, at the time still Yugoslavia, I believe. They bombed Yugoslavia for a straight 3 months. And they throw like 14,000 bombs, including depleted uranium bombs and cluster bombs. Why? What's the problem they have with Serbia?
Well, the reason they're antagonistic to Serbia is twofold. Firstly, it is a proudly independent country and society and nation. And, you know, if you know the Balkans, you'll know that the Serbs have a particular reputation for being particularly proud and prickly and not easy to push around or manipulate. The other reason, straightforwardly, is that Serbia has this very long, very strong relationship with Russia. They've always ended up on the same side in every conflict. The languages are sufficiently close that people from each country can understand the other. So there is that. And of course, they're both Slavs and they're both Orthodox. So there is this long-standing sense that Serbia is too difficult to control and ultimately too close to the Russians. And
Okay.
some European states undoubtedly have deep, long-standing historic grievances against Serbia, particularly, I have to say, Germany,
Okay.
which sees many of the problems that it had in the world wars as ultimately responsible, as ultimately explainable as a result of the crisis in the Balkans that arose in the first decade of the
That's true.
20th
Yeah, that's
century
right. Yeah.
around Serbia. So there are these many factors, in play. But of course, you can explain the dislike of Serbia, but there comes a point where the explanations themselves become insufficient to fully explain the sort of visceral feelings that have evolved. And these visceral feelings now have become particularly extreme. And part of the reason is that Serbia refuses to accept the blame for the 1990s Balkan Wars. The Western powers, I'm going to say straightforwardly, set about breaking up Yugoslavia. They wanted to get Serbia to accept the blame for that. Serbia refuses to do so. And that has exasperated and infuriated the West. So they're very angry with Serbia for all kinds of reasons. I think this is the main one at the moment, that the Serbs refuse to accept that they are somehow responsible for what happened in the Balkans, the tragedies in the Balkans in the 1990s. And by refusing to accept that, they throw back the responsibility on the Western powers.
Okay. And did they try to get rid of Vučić, some kind of because he resigned from his party, right? He's still the president,
Yes.
but he resigned. So
Yes.
there was something that's going on, right? They were trying to some kind
Yes.
of regime change.
I'm not entirely. I won't pretend. I'm not an expert on Serbian internal politics, but certainly there are people protesting in Belgrade, and there are these strange moves going on in Belgrade as well. And the Russian embassy has made it absolutely clear that, as far as they're concerned, what they're seeing is another regime change attempt being made in Serbia. For various reasons, knowing Serbia, I don't think it will succeed. And this is the one country in the Balkans where there is a critical mass of people who would oppose any such attempt. I mean, it was tried out in the early 2000s. It basically succeeded in ousting President Milosevic, who was the leader of Serbia during the Yugoslav crisis. But then, of course, a reaction set in Serbia, and a lot of the work of that color revolution was undone. And at the same time, as a result of that backlash, the Serbs themselves have become much more experienced and familiar in understanding these kind of regime change policies that the West follows. So I don't think it will succeed. But again, I want to stress, I'm not an expert on Serb internal politics. So there may be more things going on than I actually know.
Okay. But Turkey, you are the expert on Turkey, Erdogan. Okay, Turkey just had election. They were trying to get rid of Erdogan for a while, right? They were a coup not that long ago, and that was unsuccessful. I guess the Russian helped him, alerted him, I think. And then now the election, they were trying to. For a while, I thought, they had some pollings showing that he's going to lose or something like that. But then turns out those pollings are not correct. Is that what it is?
That's exactly what it was. I mean, I think one of the things you have to understand about opinion polls in the West is that they're not reliable. They have ceased to be reliable a long time ago. And in fact, it's a classic device now that's used in advance of regime change operations. You have an election. It looks like the incumbent whom you don't like is going to win. So you publish a whole stream of opinion polls, which on the contrary suggest that he's going to lose. And when he does win, you say, well, he can't have won fairly or properly because the opinion polls point
Yeah.
the other way. And I mean, I've seen
Uh-huh.
that happen time and time again. These opinion polls were an attempt to do precisely that, but they ran up against a fundamental problem, which is that even that part of Turkish society, which doesn't particularly like Erdogan, doesn't want the United States involving itself in Turkey's affairs. So the result was that the opposition, I think to many people's frustration, has accepted the outcome of these elections. So the regime change operation is essentially
Right.
dead in the water. It never got going, even though I'm pretty sure that it was something that some people wanted. And of course, John Bolton
Oh yeah, John Bolton. Yeah.
has been, he's been actively calling for it, and he's set up his own think tank to organize it and all that kind of thing.
Well, but what's the reason they hate him so much? Erdogan, just because he's not listening, he's not easy to control. Is that the only reason?
Well, it's because he is impossible to control. And Erdogan, I mean, he's a complicated man, and you can make many criticisms of him. But what he has achieved, and it is a real achievement, he's achieved two things. Firstly, within Turkey itself, he has broken the power of those institutions, those very, very well-established institutions in Turkey, which historically favored the alliance with the United States.
Oh,
And that was what happened basically with the 2016 coup. That was the last attempt, basically. The army has always been in Turkey, has always historically been very committed to the alliance with the United States, to Turkey's membership of NATO. Other institutions in Turkey, the judiciary, the large parts of the civil service, the intelligence agencies, it was the same. Erdogan, through mobilization of public support and his successful creation of his party, has been able to withstand all of these attempts and break these forces. And the result is that the United States doesn't have the leverage, the ability to control politics within Turkey to the extent that it did. And Turkey being a big country and potentially a powerful country, it is becoming increasingly nervous as Turkey is starting to follow its own policies and is starting to drift away. And that is why they want to see Erdogan go, because he's got this background behind him and it makes them very nervous.
At the same time, I also think he's a complicated figure, like you said.
Yeah.
His relationship with Putin is not necessarily always that good. And he's not well liked in China either. You see, he has been harboring some of the terrorists from Xinjiang. I think in Turkey, they even call Xinjiang, some people probably call it East Turkestan or something like that. So China is not very happy because in 2013, there was a series of terrorist attacks in that area, in the Xinjiang area. People died. A few hundred people died. It's not well published in the West, but that was happened. Many of them are Uyghurs. Okay, so it's not just, it's a terrorist attack. That's what it is. And some of those separatist people, they later escaped and they are in Turkey. You see, he's complaining that the Sweden harboring some of the Kurds, and he calls them terrorists. But he himself is harboring people from Xinjiang who are, China sees as terrorists. So you see, he's not like in the West, the Western governments, and he has a complicated relationship with Putin and with China. So he's a very complicated person, I think.
He is an extremely complicated man. And by the way, Putin has actually given an interview in which he says that he finds dealing with Erdogan extremely difficult. And I think that's an understatement. The other thing about Erdogan, by the way, is that if you follow the public information that the Kremlin provides, Erdogan is the single world leader who telephones Putin most often. I mean, he's calling Putin constantly. And I sometimes have to wonder whether Putin really welcomes all these calls. I can imagine him saying to himself, oh no, not again, not Erdogan on the line. But anyway, so Erdogan has been doing this, and you're absolutely correct. He's done many things that have annoyed the Russians a lot. I mean, about 2 years ago, for example, he welcomed Zelensky to Turkey. He said Turkey and Ukraine are brothers. We're going to build up your military. And of course, we support your membership of NATO.
Okay.
And the Russians were not pleased. I mean, they were, in fact, they were very, very angry about that. And of course, he's also supported Azerbaijan in his war against Armenia, and many Russians weren't happy about that. And he's made efforts to try and expand Turkish influence in the Caucasus, which again the Russians aren't happy with. And he's played a very, very important and significant role in Central Asia. He's pursued this policy of trying to build up Turkish influence in Central Asia and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and all of these places. These are Turkic nations, and somehow he imagines a kind of Turkish Commonwealth. The problem with Erdogan, and I'm going to say, I think he's not a very educated man. I don't think he has particular knowledge of the outside world. I think he has a very strong sense of grievance about the way in which he feels that Turkey, and he is a Turkish nationalist more than anything else, has been treated by the world over many years. And I think he wants to assert Turkey as a great power. Now, I think what he's come to realize as he's grown older and perhaps a little wiser is that Turkey isn't the great power that he would like it to be. It's certainly an important power, but you can't end up conducting a foreign policy which ends up offending and antagonizing everybody. You have to decide in the end who you're going to make the better relationships with. So over the last few years, he's been making a serious effort. And I think this is one thing I will say for him. He does seem to learn. He's been making an effort to try to adjust his foreign policy and to make it a bit more realistic. So he's looking for a settlement in Syria. He wants to meet President Assad of Syria after trying for years to overthrow President Assad of Syria. He's made up with the Saudis. He didn't get on with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. They had a huge row over the Khashoggi affair. Now he's trying to become friends with the Saudis again. And the Saudis seem to be willing to listen to him. And of course, he's had this very complicated and difficult relationship with Putin. But he's had a better relationship in recent years. And the latest conversation between Putin and Erdogan, which took place on the 29th of May, just after the election result, was a very friendly one. I mean, they spoke to each other, in warm terms. Now, the contrast, and this is where we come back to the Americans lecturing people, is we've had, at the same time as he was talking to Putin, he had a call from President Biden. And it's fascinating to compare the readouts, the one the White House has published at this call and the Turkish readout, because the White House readout is, telephone to speak, congratulate President Erdogan on his victory. And we reminded him that, he's a NATO ally and we need to work together as NATO to approach challenges together and to take into account the security environment. And we're going to have this big NATO meeting in Vilnius, and we expect Turkey to play a role. So again, in effect, the Americans telling Erdogan what they expect of him, as opposed to the Russians just telephoning him up after he's won an election and telling him congratulations and look forward to working with you in the future. So what I think Erdogan has understood is that, yes, he's made bad mistakes. He's made mistakes with the Chinese. He's made mistakes with the Russians. He's made mistakes with the Saudis. He's made lots of mistakes. But ultimately, if he lets them, these countries, the Russians, the Saudis, the Chinese, will work with him. With the Americans, you can't work with them because ultimately they will always want you to work for them. And that's a fundamental difference.
Yeah. I think Turkey, don't you think this empire dream dies hard? That Turkey, Erdogan want to, I guess, rebuild the Ottoman Empire if he could, if only he could. And we just talked about Poland, right? They want to see the revitalization of the Poland Empire, I guess. You live in an empire, I'm sure there are plenty of people in Britain still have hard time to accept Britain is no longer an empire. I live in an empire going down, that there's plenty of people in Washington within the Beltway holding fast. They are doing everything they can to try and hold on to this empire thing, even though I have to say, as a regular citizen living here, having an empire, I'm not sure it's really benefiting me or many of my people. In fact, I live in a small town. I just recently have some people complaining about the pipelines, the gas pipeline going through their backyard, literally their backyard. And they go into the coast, and then they got processed into liquefied natural gas going to Europe. You see, that pipeline going through their backyard is not benefiting them. They're very unhappy about this. And they are not selfish people. I met several of them. They were telling me, they said, if really the coastal cities needs this energy, I'm okay with it. I don't like it, but I'm okay with it. The fact is, it's going to Europe. The liquefied natural gas going to Europe. It's not even benefiting the Americans, right? It's just the corporations, those gas companies get record earning. They make money. That's all there is. It doesn't benefit the United States. We don't. So being an empire is not really benefiting regular people. But at the elite, there are always people who keep on wanting to have empires, seems to me like.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we discussed this with Britain extensively in our last program, and you're absolutely right. Poland, they still have this hankering to become once again, the great Polish Commonwealth. You have the same, as you said, in Turkey, and of course, Erdogan had his neo-Ottoman foreign policy, which is a crazy idea, actually, completely bore no relation to any kind of reality. I'm not going to deny it. There are a few people in Russia who think like that also. I mean, there are people who, I mean, I don't think that they are anywhere close to the center of power. I think in Moscow, the government is pretty tough-minded and realistic. And of course, they have the consolation that they're still, to some extent at least, a great power.
Yes.
But, nonetheless, there are some people who would like to see things reconstituted as they were. I don't think that there are many. But fundamentally, you're absolutely right. Empires are an exhausting thing for the country that runs them. They sap its energy. They lead it into all kinds of very dubious moral choices and decisions. I'm being restrained in what I say there. But I mean, they result in all kinds of mistakes, and ultimately they're economically ruinous. I mean, Britain is in a terrible economic condition. I mean, the British government is now talking about imposing price controls, which
that's what I read.
Which is I mean, because the inflation rates are so out of control here. So where we were in Britain, the manufacturing capital of the world, where we were also the financial capital of the world, we are at the moment neither of those things, and we sense that we are going down. And if you want to look at the explanation for that, it is because we frittered away our energy building up the empire. The empire made some people incredibly rich. It created, as we discussed in our previous program, huge divisions within our own society. It created all kinds of old institutions that no longer work well. And you see the same in the United States. And you see also this lingering desire always in all these countries to recreate the past, to find some way of achieving the same, position that your country had 50, 100 years ago. Now, you see, this is where China has this enormous advantage, because it doesn't have any of that. China never pursued overseas empires. It never had colonies or anything of that kind. It had long history of interaction with the people of Inner Asia, which still continues. But it's never been an expansionist state in that kind of way. It's always focused on itself. We discussed this again in our previous program. The Chinese literature is not about war. And if there is, it is about war. It is about conflict within China, the three kingdoms, for example, things of that sort. So China has this enormous advantage. And that's, I think, one fundamental reason why China is now rising and all of these other countries are becoming exhausted and tired and are making all these mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems the one place that doesn't seem want to have the empire ambition is China. Yeah, that's how I feel like. Yeah. Now, what is Liz Truss' visit to Taiwan's reaction? Are there any reactions in UK or people don't pay attention at all? She's, I guess, going there. What's the purpose of her visit? She's trying to revitalize her comeback, or purely just for money? She get paid, she does get paid to go there. The Taiwan people, the Taiwanese government is paying her. So what's her goal here?
Yeah, of course, money plays a big role, and I have to say the Taiwanese government paying her to come. I mean, it just goes to show that they have no idea very much about the mood in Britain, because, frankly, if you're talking about the British public, the last person they're going to listen to at the present time is Liz Truss. I mean, she's a completely discredited figure within the larger British public. But we come back to what we were talking about just a moment ago. Within the Conservative Party, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's position is looking weaker. His party, the Conservative Party under his leadership, has done very badly in some local elections recently. It looks like it's heading for a big defeat in the election which is coming. The economy is not in a good way. As I said, the Conservative government is now considering price controls on food. So there is concern. And when the Conservatives start feeling that they're going to lose an election, they start saying to themselves, well, maybe if we change the leader, if we carry out some kind of rearrangement, if you like, then that might, even if it doesn't prevent the defeat, it might make the defeat less bad. And this is a very common feature of British Conservative politics. It's why they're so unstable, by the way. So Liz Truss, who very much wants to be back at the centre of events, if not as Prime Minister, at least perhaps as a member of the cabinet, wants to gain attention. She goes to Taiwan, she makes a speech. She knows that most people in Britain aren't going to be interested, but she's not addressing most of the people in Britain. She's addressing a group of people within the Conservative Party, particularly MPs, Conservative MPs in the House of Commons, most of whom are deeply right-wing, if I can call it that, nationalistic, imperialistic types. People, the kind of people we've talked about, who've never got over the fact that Britain is no longer an empire. Several of them are ex-military officers with all the background that comes with that. So that's the constituency that she's trying to win over. And it's worked. If you go to the sort of newspapers and magazines which these people read, the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator, whatever, she's actually had a good press. Because these people are very anti-China at the moment for all kinds of reasons that we've discussed before. So Liz Truss goes there, she makes this speech. They all go around and say to each other, well, Liz might not have been a success as a Prime Minister, but she's saying all the right things on foreign policy.
All right. So we will see if she gets some coming back. I'm going to ask you some question lighthearted. We'll see if it's lighthearted, but I think they are, because there are lots of people interested. So last year, I believe Nikki has some reports about Germany. So German museum dig into legacy of Boxer rebellion looting, and then it says a joint review of holdings of Chinese scholars to lead to return of artifacts. Okay, that's one.
Yeah.
Okay, next. Yeah. So Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone back from the British Museum. Okay, is it now time to heal the wounds inflicted by the colonial power? So this is, I think, last September. Now, recently in March here, Greece welcomes return of ancient artifacts from Acropolis kept by the Vatican for centuries, putting pressure on the British Museum to hand back sculptures. So I guess it's they're talking about marble sculptures.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to know the general public feeling about the British Museum, all those artifacts, right? They are plenty coming from all over the world during the colonial era. And then you as a Greek, how do you feel about that?
Well, I should first of all declare an interest. My aunt, when she was Minister of Culture in Greece back in the 1980s, was at the forefront of the campaign to get the marbles returned to Greece. So I mean, I have those particular feelings. But can I say generally? I mean, how does the British public in general feel? Well, the British public, just as we've discussed before, they find it very difficult to understand that other nations might feel unhappy about the fact that all their most important and valuable artifacts were plundered by the European colonial powers in the period that they were. I mean, this is something that they find very difficult to understand. And I think they're against it. They're against returning these things because, they say, well, we have them now, so they're ours. And we don't want to see the British Museum broken up. We don't want to see the Louvre broken up. We don't want to see the Berlin museums broken up. We don't want any of those things. And of course, in Britain, it's particularly important. It's a particularly touchy issue because, of course, Britain was the biggest colonial power. It was in the 19th century when these collections were amassed. It was the world's most powerful country. So it has amassed treasures in London and across Britain on a scale that you cannot imagine. Now, can I just say, for some reason, the British had very selective ideas about Chinese art. So they weren't interested in Chinese painting, which they didn't understand. But we still, if you go around Britain, if you go to British houses, the big houses, you still find lots of items of Chinese porcelain taken in the wars of 1860, in the so-called Boxer Rebellion, which wasn't a rebellion, by the way. How could it be when the Empress supported it? I mean, it wasn't a rebellion, but never mind. Let's not get into the details of all of that.
Yeah.
But anyway, Britain is gorged with all of these artworks, all of these treasures. I mean, if you go to the Percival David Foundation, a museum very few people in China, I think, or at least the world know about. So one of the most extraordinary collections of Chinese porcelain you will find outside China. It is extraordinary what they have, including an awful lot of Sung Dynasty porcelain. And I believe there's one type of Sung Dynasty porcelain of which at one time, half the items in the world were in this museum because
what's the name again?
Percival David.
David
So,
Museum. Okay.
As I said, Britain is stuffed with this sort of thing. So at some point, the Western powers, the colonial powers, need to come to some kind of reckoning about this. They need to understand that, this didn't come freely. It was taken. I mean, if you go into a country and you seize things and you bring them back and plunder them, be they Benin bronzes or Chinese porcelain or British Elgin marbles. I mean, they always say, well, Elgin paid for the marbles, but he bought them in a very corrupt way, actually. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if he hadn't been the British ambassador in the Ottoman court. So you are never going to come to terms with the fact that your empire has gone if you hold on to the proceeds in that sort of fashion. And that's something that, as I said, I don't think the European publics have internalized at all.
And some of those artifacts really has a lot of the cultural history significance, right? Those marbles are, and I think some Egyptian artifacts really has maybe even their religious, significance. And of course, in China, those things has a lot of history, right? The historical significance. Yeah.
Well, they have enormous significance. Of course, the British don't always, or the British or the French or the Germans or whoever, don't always understand the significance that some of these artworks have to the culture that they've been taken from. But of course, they don't also understand that the manner in which they were taken can also be an open wound. I mean, you don't have to spend much time studying the history of China to understand that the way in which the country was plundered, for example, in those expeditions, the one of 1860, when the Summer Palace was destroyed, by the way, I think it was the son of Lord Elgin who stole the marbles. So it's the father stole the marbles, the son burnt down the Summer Palace. Just saying. But anyway, this is also an open wound for many of these societies. Now, I don't want to say that all of the art that's come to us has come through plunder. Some of it perhaps was bought in a legitimate way, but even that begs questions, because if you're a wealthy British collector in Shanghai in 1900 buying porcelain, you're going to have a very different kind of pull than you will have a kind of ability to get things which you might not do if you were just a collector, if I can put it like that.
You understand that the interest of this, it is from time to time there's always talking about is it time to put pressure. I think that the related is the royal family. They own those diamonds and with the coronation. So I think both South Africa and India has been asking those diamonds, but it's a different deal, right? Those diamonds belongs to the royal family, not the British Museum. Is that right? So
that is absolutely correct. They're in fact, I believe, technically, they're property of the British Crown, which is a separate entity from the individual who is the king. But anyway, whatever. I mean, the fact is, I don't think we need to spend too much time debating this. The point is, they're owned by the British state. Remember, the British Museum is also owned by the British state. So it's different. It's different parts of the British state that owns all of these things, and they are a legacy of empire. I mean, I talked about the things that the British took from China, because, well, I mean, you're from China, so we have that connection. But I mean, in India, it's even worse. The British directly ruled India. I mean, the amount of things they took from India and the amount of destruction they did in India was proportionately much greater. I mean, if you go to Delhi and you visit the fort, the Red Fort in Delhi, it's what most people don't know is that what you see today is only a remnant of what had been there before the British destroyed it. So it's this whole complicated history which the British have never acknowledged or accepted. This is one of the interesting things about Westerners. If they did something, but it happened 50, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, well, that's history. We don't worry about that. That's in the past. If it happens today to us or to people we support, well, then it's outrageous. It's monstrous. It's an entirely inappropriate and terrible thing.